The early morning mist settled quietly over the fields as Harold Thompson worked with calm precision among his vegetable rows. At 70 years old, Harold moved with a steady strength, every movement deliberate. His past as a Navy SEAL, though long behind him, had taught him the value of patience and purpose. Tending to his small farm in this tranquil valley had become his way to find peace after years of turmoil. The peace didn't last long. The roar of engines shattered the stillness. A gang of bikers, the infamous Iron Riders, approached the farm, their engines growling as they kicked up dust along the dirt road. Harold straightened, squinting toward the approaching noise. He knew they were trouble. Rumor had it that they had been shaking down nearby farms for money. Harold was no stranger to confrontation, but his life had changed. Violence was not what he sought anymore. The bikers came to a stop in front of Harold, the leader's voice booming, "Nice little farm you got here, old man. Would be a real shame if something happened to it." The man, with a leather vest and tattoos crawling up his neck, smirked, clearly confident that they would intimidate this solitary farmer. If you want to see how Harold handles this unexpected confrontation, make sure to stay with us. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Harold looked at the gang calmly, his sharp eyes betraying none of his thoughts. These men were bullies, just like the ones he had dealt with his entire life, from battlefields abroad to business suits at home. But Harold was no pushover, and he wasn't about to let these thugs hurt his community. The biker leader, who called himself Razor, stepped closer, sneering as he pointed to Harold's vegetable crates. "We're here to offer you some protection. $5,000 a month and nothing happens to your crops or your property. Understand?" Harold didn't move, his face impassive. He knew violence was what they expected, but he also knew something more important. He had people depending on him. He could not afford to escalate this. Still, letting them think they could bully him was not an option. "Why don't you fellas just leave peacefully?" Harold's voice was calm, almost friendly, but there was a steel edge to his words. "I don't want trouble, but I'm not afraid of it either." Razor laughed, signaling to his crew. One of the bikers, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward and swung a chain at Harold. But before anyone could blink, Harold had moved. His training kicked in, and with a swift motion, he caught the chain, twisted, and had the man on the ground, breathless. The other bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering as they saw Razor's enforcer gasping in the dirt. Razor's eyes narrowed, but Harold spoke up before things could escalate further. "This is your only warning. Leave now." For a long moment, Razor considered, then spat on the ground. "We'll be back, old man, and you'll regret this." He motioned for the others to follow, and with a roar of engines, they sped away, leaving Harold alone once more. Harold watched them leave, his gaze steady until the dust settled and the sound of engines faded. He knew this wasn't the end of it. Razor's threats weren't empty. Men like him rarely backed down after a defeat, especially one that bruised their pride. Harold sighed and looked around the farm. It was peaceful again, but that peace felt fragile now, like the calm before an inevitable storm. He walked back toward the barn, his mind already working through what needed to be done. The Iron Riders would return, and when they did, Harold wanted to be ready. He had to protect not only himself but also the people he cared about, his neighbors, friends, and the community that had become his family. He wasn't alone in this fight, and he knew it was time to call on that strength. That evening, Harold sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he made a list. Reinforce the fences. Set up more lights around the property. Make a few calls to some old friends who might still owe him a favor or two. He wasn't planning on starting a war, but he also wasn't going to roll over and let the Iron Riders take what they wanted. The next morning, Harold drove into town. The sun was just rising, casting a golden glow over the valley. He parked his truck outside the diner, where he knew he'd find Sarah getting ready for the breakfast rush. She looked up, surprised to see him so early. "Harold? Everything okay?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Sarah, but I need to talk to you and a few others. It's about those bikers." Sarah's face fell, worry clouding her eyes. "They came back?" Yeah, and they're planning on coming again, Harold said, his voice steady. I don't want anyone getting hurt, but I think it's time we all stood together. If we show them that we're not afraid, that this community won't be bullied, maybe we can stop this before it goes too far. By the time the sun was fully up, Harold had gathered a small group at the diner. Sarah, Pastor Johnson, the Andersons, and a few other locals who had faced the Iron Riders' threats before. They listened as Harold laid out his plan, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. He wasn't asking them to fight, but he was asking them to stand up, to be seen, to show the bikers that this town wouldn't be cowed. They want us scared, Harold said, looking around the table. But if we stand together, they'll see that we're not alone. We protect each other. That's what makes this place home. There was a moment of silence, then Sarah nodded, her expression firm. I'm in, whatever it takes. One by one, the others agreed, a sense of unity growing among them. They might not have Harold's military training, but they had something just as strong, a love for their community and a refusal to let fear drive them out. Harold left the diner feeling a sense of hope. The Iron Riders might come back with more men and more threats, but they would be met with something far more powerful than they expected. This wasn't just Harold's fight anymore, it was everyone's. And together, they would show the Iron Riders that they had chosen the wrong place and the wrong people to try and intimidate. Harold drove his old pickup into town that afternoon. He had friends here, people who had supported him since he moved in 10 years ago after his retirement. There was Sarah, who ran the diner, her heart bigger than her small business. Pastor Johnson, who always lent a helping hand to anyone in need. And Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, who owned the general store. These were the people who had welcomed him when he first came to the valley, people who had made him feel like part of their family. Harold knew that he couldn't face the Iron Riders alone. They had threatened his farm, but this wasn't just about his land. The entire community was at risk, and if there was one thing Harold had learned over the years, it was that people were stronger when they stood together. He had seen that kind of unity in combat, and he knew it was the key to survival now. He spent the next few hours visiting each of his friends, explaining what had happened and what he feared was coming. They all agreed to meet at the church that evening. As Harold walked into the small white chapel, he saw familiar faces filling the pews, friends, neighbors, and even a few people he didn't expect, like young Tommy, who worked at the hardware store, and old Mrs. Jensen, who rarely left her home. The atmosphere was tense. Most people had heard about the Iron Riders and their threats. Some were scared, others angry. Sarah stood up first, her voice trembling but resolute. We can't just let them take over, she said. They've terrorized other farms. If we don't stand up, we're next. Pastor Johnson nodded in agreement. But we need to do this wisely, he said, his calm voice carrying through the room. Violence won't solve this. We need to show them that they're not welcome here, but without becoming like them. Harold looked around the room, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also the courage. They weren't soldiers, but they were people with something worth fighting for. I have a plan, he said, stepping forward. It's not about fighting them on their terms. It's about showing them that this community stands together, that we won't be intimidated. A murmur spread through the crowd as people exchanged glances. Harold could see the doubt in some of their eyes, but also a spark of hope. He continued, We'll need to set up watches. We'll work in shifts, make sure that no one is ever alone. We'll reinforce fences, add more lights, and most importantly, we'll show them that we're not afraid. Tommy raised his hand, his young face pale but determined. I can help with the lights, he said. I know how to rig up some of the old floodlights from the hardware store. Mrs. Anderson spoke next, her voice steady. I'll organize meals for everyone on watch. If we're going to do this, we need to keep our strength up. One by one, people began to volunteer, offering tools, time, whatever they had. Even old Mrs. Jensen spoke up, her frail voice surprising everyone. I may not be able to do much, but I can bake. No one should face danger on an empty stomach. A small smile tugged at Harold's lips. This was what he had hoped for. Not a call to arms, but a call to unity. The Iron Riders might be tough, but they had never faced anything like the spirit of this community. As the meeting ended, people lingered, talking in hushed tones, making plans. Harold could feel the shift in the air. Fear was still there, but it was mixed with something stronger: resolve. These were good people, and they were ready to defend their home, not with fists and weapons, but with solidarity and courage. That night, Harold sat on his porch, watching as the first of the floodlights were set up along the perimeter of his farm. He could see Tommy and a few others working together, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they ran wires and tested connections. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were a blur of activity. The townspeople worked tirelessly, setting up lights, reinforcing fences, and organizing watches. Pastor Johnson coordinated schedules, ensuring that no one was left alone, while Sarah turned the diner into a makeshift headquarters where people could check in, grab a hot meal, and get updates. Even the children got involved, painting signs that read, "This is our home and we stand together," which they placed at the entrances to the town and along the road leading to Harold's farm. The message was clear: they would not be intimidated. As the sun set on the third day, Harold stood at the edge of his property, looking out at the lights that now illuminated the fields. He could see the Andersons in the distance, patrolling the edge of their land, and he knew that similar scenes were playing out all across the valley. It was a simple show of force, but it spoke volumes. They weren't going to back down. The Iron Riders had power in their numbers, in their ability to intimidate, but Harold knew that true strength came from something deeper. It came from people who cared about each other, who were willing to stand up for what was right, not because they wanted a fight, but because they wanted peace. On the fourth night, Harold heard the rumble of engines in the distance. The Iron Riders were coming back, just as he knew they would. He felt a knot of tension in his chest, but he took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't alone. The lights were on, the community was ready, and they would face whatever came together. As the bikers drew closer, Harold could see their headlights cutting through the darkness, a line of them snaking down the road. He stood at the entrance to his farm, his shoulders squared, Sarah and Pastor Johnson beside him. Behind them, the townspeople stood, a wall of quiet, determined faces. The lead biker, Razor, pulled up, his sneer fading as he took in the scene before him. This wasn't what he had expected. Harold stepped forward, his voice carrying across the silent field. "This is our home. We won't be scared off. If you're smart, you'll turn around and leave now." For a moment, there was only silence, the tension thick in the air. Then, slowly, Razor revved his engine, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the line of people, the lights, the signs. He spat on the ground, then turned his bike around. One by one, the other bikers followed, the roar of their engines fading into the night. Harold let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had done it, not with fists or threats, but with unity. He turned to the others, a smile breaking across his face. "Thank you," he said simply. "We did it." The valley had stood together, and they had won, at least for now. There might be more challenges ahead, but Harold knew they could face anything as long as they stood together. A week later, the Iron Riders returned. This time, there were more of them, at least 20 bikes roaring down the dusty road to Harold's farm. Razor looked more confident, smug even, as they surrounded the farmhouse. He dismounted, a wicked grin spreading across his face. The rest of the bikers followed suit, engines rumbling in the background like distant thunder. But Harold wasn't alone. As Razor dismounted and approached, ready to make good on his threats, the townspeople emerged. They came from behind barns, from the fields, from the tree lines. Farmers, neighbors, friends. They carried no weapons, only their presence, their numbers. It was a quiet yet powerful show of unity, a clear message that Harold and his farm were not alone. Sarah stood beside Harold, her chin high. Pastor Johnson stepped forward, holding a sign that read, "This is our home." Mr. Anderson, his injured leg in a brace, leaned on his cane, staring Razor down without a hint of fear. The rest of the townspeople spread out, forming a line, shoulder to shoulder, their faces determined and resolute. Razor hesitated. This was not what he had expected. Bullies thrive on fear, but here there was no fear, only determination. Harold stepped forward, his voice strong and unwavering, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You see, Razor, This farm isn't just mine. It belongs to this community. We work together, we stand together, and we won't be scared off." Razor's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He glanced back at his men, some of whom looked uneasy, shifting their feet and exchanging nervous glances. Harold continued, taking another step forward, his gaze locked on Razor's. "If you want to take on one of us, you'll have to take on all of us. But why not do something different? Why not leave this life behind and find something worth building?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the fields. Razor looked around at his men, then at the line of people standing firm in front of him. This was not the fearful crowd he had hoped to intimidate. He wasn't used to facing such quiet, determined resistance. One of the bikers, a younger man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke up. "Razor, maybe we should just go," he muttered, barely loud enough for Razor to hear. The uncertainty was spreading like wildfire through the group. Razor clenched his jaw, his hand twitching as if he were about to reach for the chain hanging at his belt. He looked at Harold, then at the people standing behind him. Ordinary men and women, unarmed but unyielding. The strength of their resolve was palpable, and for the first time, Razor felt his confidence falter. "You think this is over, old man?" Razor spat on the ground, his voice filled with venom, though the bravado had lost its edge. "You think you can just stand there and everything will be fine?" Harold didn't flinch. "I think that if you want to hurt us, you'll have to look every one of us in the eye and decide if it's worth it. We won't fight you on your terms, Razor, but we won't back down either." Razor took a step back, his eyes scanning the line of townspeople once more. They were silent, but their silence spoke volumes. They weren't challenging him with fists or weapons. They were challenging him with something far stronger: unity, courage, and the refusal to bow to fear. He turned abruptly, mounting his bike. "Let's go," he barked, his voice tight with frustration. For a moment, the bikers hesitated, but then, one by one, they climbed back on their bikes. The engines roared to life, the sound echoing through the fields as they turned and rode away, dust kicking up in their wake. The roar of engines faded into the distance, and a heavy silence settled over the farm. Harold turned to face his friends and neighbors, his expression softening. He saw relief, pride, and even a few tears. Sarah reached over, placing a hand on Harold's arm. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Pastor Johnson stepped forward, raising the sign that read, "This is our home," and the crowd erupted into cheers. They hugged, laughed, and for a moment, the weight of what they had just faced lifted, replaced by a profound sense of triumph. Harold smiled, nodding at each of them. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just my home. It's ours." And today, we showed them what that means. The valley had stood together, and they had won. Not through violence, but through solidarity. Harold knew that there might be more challenges ahead, but he also knew that they could face anything as long as they faced it together. Slowly, Razor turned back to his bike. Without a word, he climbed on and revved the engine. One by one, the other bikers followed, until the roar of engines faded into the distance. The townspeople let out a collective breath, relief washing over them. Harold turned to his neighbors, smiling for the first time that day. "Thank you," he said. "This is what makes a community. Standing together, not giving in to fear." That night, the town gathered at Sarah's diner for an impromptu celebration. There was laughter, food, and the warmth of knowing that they had faced a threat together and won. Not through violence, but through unity and resolve. The diner was filled with the comforting smells of home-cooked meals, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the room. The tension that had weighed on them for weeks seemed to lift, replaced by the joy of shared triumph. Pastor Johnson offered a prayer of thanks, his words heartfelt as he spoke of courage, community, and the strength they found in each other. People nodded in agreement, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the diner's lights. It wasn't just about protecting Harold's farm anymore. It was about protecting each other, about building a future free from fear. Harold sat at the counter, a mug of coffee in his hands, watching as his friends and neighbors celebrated. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was why he had come to the valley all those years ago, for the sense of belonging, the feeling that he was part of something greater than himself. As the night wore on, Harold knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, but he was no longer worried. Together, they could face anything. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Some of the bikers returned, not for revenge, but to ask if they could work on the farm. They were tired of the life they had led, tired of running, tired of fear. Harold welcomed them, offering them honest work, a chance to start over. The farm became more than just Harold's refuge. It became a symbol of hope, a place where people could find second chances. Harold knew his late wife would have been proud. The roses she had planted, which now lined the driveway, seemed to bloom brighter than ever, as if celebrating the new beginning for everyone. Word of Harold Thompson and the Iron Riders spread beyond the valley, becoming a story of courage, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right. People from neighboring towns came to visit, to see the farm where enemies became friends, where lives were transformed. They came to learn from Harold, to hear how a community's strength had turned anger into understanding, fear into hope. As the seasons changed, so did the people of the valley, growing stronger together. The bikers who chose to stay became part of the community, their rough exteriors softened by the simple beauty of hard work and belonging. They helped harvest crops, fix fences, and even joined in community events, slowly finding their place. Harold often found himself standing at the edge of the fields at sunset, watching the men and women who had once been adversaries work side by side. He felt the spirit of his wife in every bloom, in every smile shared among the workers. The valley had become what he had always dreamed of, a place of peace, of redemption, and of new beginnings for everyone who needed it.